I'm Eric Osborne. Welcome to my podcast. In the first episode, we talked about the suffering that often follows success. Today, instead of focusing on the problem, I want to focus on some solutions. That is what we do as successful people. And successful people also know that with the right perspective, obstacles become opportunities. So, as we talk today, if you hear any obstacles arise that you recognize in yourself, I'm going to invite you to consider them as opportunities to become a more integrated person. Or, as we mentioned in the last episode, that these plateaus become launch pads for your next level self. So, balance is what we're talking about. Balance is a moving term. It's not something that we find ourselves at and just remain there. Balance requires ongoing maintenance. And the skills that we need to maintain the kind of balance, particularly that I'm talking about today, are not the ones that you maybe are used to applying in terms of your business or material success. It doesn't mean that they're any less valuable. It just means that they may require you to develop a new skill set or a new way of approaching life. That's a good thing. It's something I've helped many people work through over the years, and it's something that I feel really passionate about because it's absolutely necessary if we're going to become the most wholly developed and truly successful people that we can be and really have the impact on the world that we want to. I know that you're here because you want to bring positive impact on our world. That's why I'm here. And I have found in my own experience that being out of balance is detrimental not only to our personal selves, but to our world and our relationships around us, including our business and material success. We are dynamic beings. Just think about all the different facets of your life. You've got friends, you've got family, you've got your work life, you've got your health. Maybe you have pets. Maybe you have ex-spouses that you co-parent with. Maybe you've got parents or siblings, colleagues at work. There are so many components. There are so many things that go into making you who you are and your life as rich and rewarding as I really hope that it is. And all of those parts of our lives require some form of balance and maintenance. Now, if we try to micromanage all of those different relationships and keep everything in balance, well, we're going to find ourselves overwhelmed and burnt out and losing relationships and letting go of things that probably benefit us a great deal. And as we find ourselves getting more and more in balance, you might find yourself letting go of relationships and obligations that really weren't serving you. We'll talk more about that later. I think of my life metaphorically kind of like the mixing board that I have here with my podcast studio, right? It's got several different outputs, channels that can be equalized. There are different buttons that impact the sound in different ways, create echo, reverb, whatever, all that stuff. And looking at my life, all these different relationships or all these different parts of my life, I see them as having the ability to either be micromanaged or to be more broadly set at a certain level that maybe it's not perfect. Maybe it's not the perfect sound, but it's going to bring me peace. And so that's what I want us to look at our lives in a similar way. How can we broadly bring balance into our lives so that we are at a state of peace rather than in anxiety or just a general sense of discord? And if you're there, you know it, particularly if you are a materially successful entrepreneur or creative person, then probably in some way you can identify with being out of balance. Maybe you look around and see that you are putting too much emphasis on the material world, that it exemplifies an excessive load rather than a more manageable one. Like none of this is to be considered criticism. It's really a required self-assessment. Because if we're going to live healthy, well-balanced lives, then we've got to be willing and able to look at our lives in the same way that we look at our businesses. I think the big question here is, are we looking at our, quote, abundance or material success as a way to validate our lives? That's one of the ways that I've been able to look at my life and see what's out of balance is, what am I looking at outside of myself to validate my inside self? I mentioned that we can broadly apply balance in our lives. And the way that that happens is by looking at our lives in three distinct parts. We've got our physical life, our emotional life, and our spiritual life. Now, I know that this is often broken down in terms of body, mind, and spirit. For me, I find it helpful to speak of it in terms of the material world, because our body is obviously a part of that, but so are all of the things around us that we take care of, including other people. Then there's the emotional life, which is occasionally or often correlated to the mental world. Now, it's interesting to consider whether or not thoughts or emotions come first. It makes a lot of sense to say that at least fundamentally emotional life comes first, because when we were little babies, we maybe had things happen around us that caused an emotional impact, but we didn't have probably the ability to form thoughts around it. And then eventually those thoughts get tied to emotions, and emotions get tied to thoughts, and we found ourselves looping the two. So it's not necessarily which one came first, but that they are both very much related. And I find that when I am able to apply emotional balance, that my thinking mental world becomes more balanced as well. And then finally, we have the spiritual world. Now, I know that I'm assuming if you're listening to my content, then you have some relationship with the spiritual world. I generally tend to think of this in terms of the metaphysical world. I know that that's a term that some folks struggle with because it's connected to New Ageism, but I understand it in a scientific perspective that the metaphysical world is this world that is above, beyond, and actually encompasses the physical world. You don't have to think about this in terms of a soul or heaven or any of that kind of talk. For me, the way that I relate to the spiritual or metaphysical world is through energy. We know that everything is energy. All matter is energy moving at a slow vibration. That's scientific knowledge that is fundamental to our understanding of the world. Now, there are absolutely ways that we can explore and engage with the spiritual, energetic self. We'll talk more about that in later episodes, but suffice it to say that you can, if you're not aware of this, tangibly get in touch with your metaphysical self. And it's not a woo-woo idea. It's a very grounded way to engage with this aspect of ourselves that, with awareness, we can bring into a healthy balance with the other aspects of our lives. Now, if you see that we apply and maintain and achieve balance in those three different parts of our lives, that our relationships are going to be better, our physical health is going to be better, our mental health is going to be better. But if we're in denial of any one of those three, or we're neglecting any one of those three, then we're going to find ourselves in dis-ease, so to speak. Without looking at the dis-ease, or without looking at the unhealthy imbalance, I'd love to focus on what it looks like when these components of ourselves are more balanced, right? So, material world. If our material self is in balance, you're going to see a number of things. Probably first and foremost, you're going to treat your body in a very different way than most people do. You're not going to be eating junk food. You're going to be getting plenty of rest. You're going to be able to joyfully take yourself to the gym and work your body and move your body. You're going to have a healthy relationship with the way you see your body when you look in the mirror. None of us are perfect, and that's great. So when you're in balance with your body, you're going to look in the mirror and actually like what you see. When you're in balance with the physical world, you're also going to probably enjoy your work. You're not going to see it as a burden or an extraction. You're going to see it as, I have gifts and talents that have been imbued in me that I want to share with the world. And in sharing those gifts and talents, I'm going to receive financial exchange that's not going to validate who I am, but it's going to allow me to positively impact the world, be that my family, be that my own physical self, or be that my community at large. And in terms of our goals and ambitions, well, then we're going to probably be approaching those with joy and excitement and inspiration rather than this sense of lack or I've got to do a thing so that people see me as valuable. No, we'll realize when we're balanced in our material selves that everything that we bring into this world physically and everything that we engage with in this world physically is actually here to bring more pleasure to ourselves and to those around us. And that is a good thing. When we're balanced emotionally, well, we find ourselves more to even kill. There's a teaching in the Eastern traditions that someone who is emotionally healthy never goes to extreme highs or extreme lows. They are, well, balanced no matter what's happening. Let's say that you achieve great success, it's just a thing. You experience great loss, it's also just a thing. If you're emotionally balanced, then we know that the things that happen outside of our lives don't have to completely dismantle our inside lives. Life is full of disruption. Life is full of joy. Life is full of sorrow. And neither one should pull us into extreme state. When our emotional world is balanced, then we don't find ourselves getting stuck in emotional loops. Yes, sure, we may have a period of moments, minutes, maybe even hours sometimes where we navigate tough emotions. We sit with them, we allow them to move through, and then they move on, and then we go on about our lives. This doesn't mean that we ignore grief or the sorrow or sadness. It just means that they don't consume us. Again, neither does joy. It's all something to be experienced equally and in balance. This emotional balance with our friends and relationships shows up as healthy boundaries where we don't need other people for our approval. We find ourselves strengthened in who we are, knowing ourselves in a centered way. We trust the way that we feel about the world around us. Our intuition becomes clear and strong, and we can make choices from a place that is not self-serving, but serves ourselves as well as the good of others. Our romantic relationships, well, we don't get caught up in those either. They don't become the thing that defines us. When we are in physical intimacy, then it's an act of real connection, not performance or, again, seeking approval. Notice how much through this conversation the need for external validation indicates internal imbalance. When we find ourselves balanced spiritually, well, then we often feel held by this great mystery around us. And we don't need to deify it. We don't need to turn that mystery into dogma or personify, deify it as some God outside of us waiting to shut us out of heaven or let us in. No, we realize that everything is perfect just as it is, that there is a mystical nature to all life experience. We can walk outside and experience the trees and the birds and nature and glory and awe. We find wonder in our experience. We even can look at our own physical bodies and see the majesty of creation therein. And again, we recognize the mystery of it all. We don't have the answers. We know that we don't have to have the answers. And in this comfort with not knowing, we often find that negative experiences like anxiety and depression dissipate rather quickly. It's often said that anxiety is living in the future and depression is living in the past. Well, we find when we are spiritually balanced that we are living in the present. And by living in the present, we can experience it with rich gratitude. This gratitude gives way to reverence, which allows us to let go of life and allow it to unfold as it sees fit rather than as we see fit. In that spiritual balance, we also find ourselves flowing with life. Opportunities arise, new relationships arise, things that we never could have dreamed of, surprises that we never could have imagined for ourselves. And whether they're good or bad surprises, we find ourselves trusting the process and letting go and going with that flow. Now, if you don't identify with a lot of the descriptions that I just gave of being in balance, it's okay. Again, you're human. We all find ourselves out of balance at times, and we all require maintenance. I have had the incredible opportunity of being with so many people in transformative experiences when they have begun to find that sense of balance in their lives. And again, the way that it expresses itself is it's not typical. It's not what we're accustomed to seeing in our daily lives when we go to our jobs and we function in the ways that society tends to function. I think about this one experience where I was working with a gentleman as he was going through a pretty profound transformation experience in his life. He was coming back into balance. This guy was he was an aircraft engineer, really incredible human being, very successful, very pragmatic individual. And he was in his 60s. He was near retirement and beginning to really consider whether or not his life had been his own. He had been beholden to others' schedules, his job, his wife, his kids, and now he was faced with this challenge that became an opportunity when he retired to explore what life looked like on his terms. And we'd spent several days together working through these questions and exploring options. And I remember there was a point we were sitting on the veranda together, and we had just come out of some pretty challenging conversation, and we're on the veranda looking out over the sea, which was about 100 yards away. And I was sitting back from him, just kind of watching him as he sat with himself. And out of nowhere, he just gets up and starts walking towards the sea. And I watched him. He walked right there to the edge where the water meets the shore. Just kind of stood there looking out at the horizon. And I just kind of thought, well, what he's thinking right now. About that time, he reached over and pulled off his watch, unbuckled it, pulled back, and just threw it at the sea. It's gone. $800 Rolex, come to find out. And he turned around pretty soon after that, walked back up and sat beside me, and he said, "Eric, when my wife asked me why I didn't call her, I'm going to tell her it's because I lost track of time." Now, it was funny, and it was very serious as well. It was a serious moment where that man drew a line, deciding to reclaim balance in his life in a very powerful way. He had given his physical world over to everybody else. Maybe that's something you do. Do you give everyone else your time rather than taking some time to yourself? And what's interesting here is the crossover between these three worlds. All right, that was a material object, and he defined himself in material space. And it also considered his emotional and spiritual selves. And so that's what we find is when we start to bring ourselves back into balance in one aspect, whether that is to draw a line or a boundary in our material world and obligations, we find that there's a shift that naturally starts to occur in maybe our spiritual and or emotional selves. Could he have come to the same conclusion had he not thrown his watch in the sea? Maybe. But it was it was a decisive action that stuck with him for probably the rest of his life. Now, doesn't mean that he didn't have to maintain that balance and continue holding that boundary. But I bet you anything, particularly when he saw the vacancy in his watch box. He was actually a watch collector. When he saw the vacancy in his watch collection, I bet you that was a regular reminder to him to maintain a little more balance in his physical life. The thing is, what keeps most of us from being in balance is not a lack of information. Our bodies know, our being knows when we're out of balance. More than anything, it's a lack of acknowledgement. That's why it's so helpful to have people on the outside or these powerful transformative experiences that allow ourselves to see ourselves from the observer perspective. This awareness leads to acknowledgement. And in this, I want to speak to two different types of acknowledgement here, right? There's the acknowledgement of the thing or the behavior or the imbalance. And then there is a deeper level of acknowledgement that realizes that whatever's happening, even the imbalance that we find ourselves in, is good for us. It's leading us to the next level of ourselves. Acknowledging from the most basic standpoint, the acceptance of the reality that we find ourselves in can feel life-threatening. It's an existential threat to realize that we have been living our lives out of alignment with who we truly are. But if we don't correct that, then that dis-ease that I mentioned earlier, it's going to set in further. It's going to come screaming at us until we listen. We can all look outside and see folks who are clearly out of balance, and that's showing up through obsession, through addiction, avoidance, spiritual bypassing, anger, abuse. There's any number of ways for us to see that in others. And if we can take those opportunities of seeing the imbalance in others to reflect on ourselves and where we're out of balance, well, then that can be a good thing. It's definitely been me, and sometimes it still is. I need outside perspectives to help me maintain my balance. I'm sure you can look back at some of my previous content and say, now that is a guy who is out of balance. For me, it was spiritual imbalance. I was too heavily weighted on the spiritual side. I neglected my material self, and it started to lead to real issues in my life. Matter of fact, the last episode of the last podcast series that I did, Not Your Guru, Courtney and I talked just about this. And that is why I ultimately ended that podcast. I needed time to bring myself back into balance. How did I come to realize that I was out of balance? Because I saw that I was emphasizing external validation of others to prove my self-worth. It was clearly an imbalance. I'm not ashamed. I'm a human being, just like you. It was only after I began to regularly go to the gym, change my diet, and value my human self as much as my spiritual self that things really started to shift. I started to naturally employ boundaries. I started to see myself as valuable when I looked in the mirror rather than needing to feel that from someone on the outside. And let me tell you, it feels so much better to be where I'm at right now than where I was before. But then, I couldn't have told you that. I was too lost in the clouds of cannabis to set healthy boundaries and value the man that I am and what I bring to the world. The actions that it required, some of those were drawing boundaries and ending relationships, some of which I had for over a decade. And yes, it was challenging, but it was so worthwhile. Now, again, this is something that I will have to continue to work at and continue to maintain in the future. It doesn't mean that I see any inherent problem with cannabis. It's absolutely a powerful medicine that has helped save many, many lives. It's been valuable to me, and I'm sure that it will be again at some point. But in order to find and maintain balance, boundaries had to be set with people and with ways of being. So I haven't said it explicitly, but in terms of transformation, in terms of finding balance, it requires three things. It requires awareness, we mentioned. It requires ownership. Didn't directly state that, but I had to take ownership of myself being out of balance. Nobody else did this to me. I chose this. I found myself in this position, and I had to take action. So, awareness, ownership, and action. Those are the three components that it takes to achieve and maintain transformation and balance. Our friend at the sea took action and threw his watch into the water. Then he took other courses of action in his life to help maintain that balance. Myself, I started going to the gym. I started eating differently. Fasting was a big part of that. I ended some very unhealthy relationships, and I took a significant break from my excessive use of cannabis. Now, I find myself in a very healthy relationship with the physical world. I had to care enough about myself to leave behind relationships, some of which were decades long. It was painful. There was definitely a lot of grieving in that process. Part of that was my relationship with cannabis. I had been 20-something years using cannabis almost on a daily. That was a very challenging relationship to end, but the payoff was enormous. And in doing so, I recognized how much I had constrained myself. Now, this is not a criticism again against anybody's actions. This is me for myself, and I'm going to encourage you to courageously explore your life, particularly with the assistance of a third party to help you identify places where you're out of balance. First way to look at it again, where are you looking to external sources of validation? I'm no different from you. We are all in this journey together. Life is about evolution. Spirituality is about evolution. The material, emotional, and physical world are all tied together, and I am here for evolution. I know if you've made it this far, you're about personal evolution as well. And I want to thank you for sticking with me. I want to thank you for even considering this conversation. Odds are you're sitting there thinking, where am I out of balance? Maybe you probably do know some places where you're out of balance. Maybe you need some encouragement. Put it in the chat. Speak to it. Be courageous. Admit where you need help. That's the first step. We are all so more capable. We are all so much more expansive than we realize. When we start to take those little steps to become the person that we know we are, the balanced, healthy person that we know we are inside, those little steps, they inspire greater steps in ourselves, and they inspire those around us. So I hope that my story of finding my balance, of helping others find their balance, or even just talking about what balance looks like has been beneficial for you. If you've made it this far, then I'm sure it has. And I would invite you to like, share, and subscribe so that more folks can get exposed to these kinds of conversations and therefore hopefully inspired to find their own balance. We all have the choice to remain comfortably unconscious or uncomfortably in the growth. You know where I stand, and I suspect you're right there with me too.